The wind swept across the plains with a mournful whistle, carrying with it the dust of another long day in the American West. The town of Dry Creek lay nestled between rugged hills and endless prairie, its wooden storefronts weather-beaten yet stubbornly upright, much like the people who lived there. It was a place where gossip traveled faster than the telegraph, and reputations were as fragile as glass. In such a town, a woman alone was more vulnerable than the cattle driven across open range. James Callahan knew this truth better than most. A tall, broad-shouldered rancher with eyes the color of storm clouds, James carried the weight of grief like an invisible yoke. His wife had died 3 winters ago during childbirth, and the child had not survived either. Since then, James had lived a life of silence. His ranch was run with mechanical precision, his days consumed by chores, and his nights marked by the hollow ache of absence. Folks respected him, but few dared to draw near. He was a man made of stone, weathered and untouchable. That was until Clara Dawson stepped off the stagecoach. Clara was not the kind of woman who blended into the background. Her presence was not loud, but it drew eyes nonetheless. She was young, not more than 23, but hardship had already carved faint lines into her otherwise delicate face. Her auburn hair was tucked neatly beneath a worn bonnet, her dress plain and patched, but her green eyes carried a quiet fire. She had arrived in Dry Creek with no family to meet her, no fortune to claim, and no husband to shield her from the curious, and sometimes predatory, eyes of the townsfolk. Within hours of her arrival, whispers began. Some said she had run away from trouble back east. Others speculated she was carrying secrets darker than the night. In a town where every stranger was a subject of suspicion, Clara was already at a disadvantage, simply by being a woman alone. The first confrontation came outside the general store. Clara had gone in for supplies, her last few coins clutched tightly in her palm, when 2 ranch hands lounging on the porch began to jeer. "Ain't decent for a lady to travel alone," one sneered. "Maybe she's looking for a man to take her in, at the right price." Laughter followed, crude and sharp. Clara held her chin high, but the flush of shame burned her cheeks. She turned quickly, only to find James Callahan standing at the end of the boardwalk. His face betrayed no expression, but his eyes fixed on the men with a cold steel that silenced their laughter in an instant. "Enough," James said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The ranch hands muttered apologies and shuffled away, leaving Clara staring at the stranger who had defended her without a word of kindness. Their paths crossed again that evening at the town's small church gathering. Clara sat quietly in the back pew, her hands folded in her lap, but the whispers persisted, louder this time. A widow whispered to her neighbor, "She'll bring trouble, mark my words." Another voice muttered, "What decent woman travels so far without kin?" It was then that Reverend Holloway, the kindly but pragmatic shepherd of the town, approached James after the service. "Mr. Callahan," he said quietly, "the young woman needs protection. This town can be cruel, and crueler still to the unwed. She won't last here unless someone gives her a name." James stiffened. "That's not my concern," he replied. "Perhaps not," the Reverend allowed, "but God puts burdens on strong shoulders. Sometimes what we call a burden is really a blessing waiting to be uncovered." The words stirred something in James, though he did not show it. That night, as he sat by the fireplace in his lonely cabin, he thought of Clara's proud chin lifted against ridicule, the vulnerability in her eyes despite her brave front. He remembered his late wife's laughter, now just an echo in the quiet halls. And against his better judgment, he felt a flicker of something he had buried long ago, the urge to protect, to shield, to matter. The decision was made not in the warmth of affection, but in the cool clarity of necessity. The following day, James found Clara standing by the well outside the boarding house. She turned as he approached, her posture wary, but not unfriendly. "I don't know your story," James said, his tone even. "And I don't need to. What I do know is this town won't give you peace unless you've got a name tied to yours." "My name?" Clara blinked, startled. "Are you saying—" "I'm offering marriage," James cut in, his jaw set. "Not for love. Not for companionship. Simply protection. You'll have a place at my ranch, and the town will have no more reason to talk. The silence that followed was heavy. Clara searched his face for mockery or malice, but found only an impenetrable wall of resolve. Her heart pounded with a mix of relief and sorrow. Marriage had once been her dream, but not like this, not as a bargain struck out of desperation. Still, she saw the danger in refusal. Alone, she would be devoured by gossip and threats. With his name, she could stand. "I accept," she whispered, though her voice trembled. And so, before the sun set that very day, Reverend Holloway bound them in marriage in the small church. No flowers adorned the pews, no music swelled in celebration. Only a handful of townsfolk attended, curious eyes watching as James Callahan and Clara Dawson exchanged vows void of romance, but heavy with necessity. When it was done, James offered Clara his arm, his expression unreadable. She placed her hand lightly upon it, her mind a whirlwind of fear and fragile hope. As they stepped out into the fading light, whispers followed them once again, but this time they carried a different tone, curiosity tinged with reluctant respect. For Clara, the marriage was both salvation and prison. For James, it was duty masquerading as indifference. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet storm was brewing. Neither of them knew it yet, but this marriage of necessity would become the crucible in which their hearts were tested, broken, and, perhaps, reborn. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of fire and gold, as two wounded souls walked into an uncertain future together, bound not by love, but by the fragile promise of survival. The morning after their hurried wedding, Clara awoke in a cabin that smelled of pine wood and ash. The walls were bare save for a single cross above the hearth, and every surface spoke of a man who valued order over comfort. James Callahan had risen before dawn, his boots absent from the door, and his presence marked only by the sound of horses whinnying in the corral outside. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, fingers clasped tightly in her lap. She was a wife now, at least in name, yet the silence of the cabin pressed upon her like a reminder of how little she truly belonged. She told herself she had chosen wisely. Marriage meant survival, but her heart longed for warmth that was not part of their bargain. James returned as the sun climbed the hills, his shirt damp with sweat from the early chores. He nodded in greeting but offered no smile. "There's coffee on the stove," he said, his voice even, almost distant. Clara rose quickly to pour him a cup, her movements careful, as though any misstep might expose the fragility of their arrangement. They ate breakfast without conversation, the scrape of forks against tin plates the only sound. Yet even in silence, Clara felt his presence like a weight she could not ignore. He was not unkind, but he carried a wall around himself, a fortress built from grief and stubborn solitude. The townsfolk, however, wasted no time in testing the new marriage. By the end of the week, whispers about Clara had not disappeared, they had only changed shape. Now, the curious eyed her when she entered the mercantile, as though trying to uncover whether she had truly secured the affections of the stoic rancher, or merely trapped him in a desperate scheme. Some women offered polite smiles laced with suspicion. Others dismissed her entirely, unwilling to welcome an outsider whose past was unknown. One afternoon, Clara overheard two matrons speaking near the shelves of flour and sugar. "Strange, isn't it? No kin, no dowry, and yet she lands Callahan. Mark my words, there's a reason she came all this way alone." Clara's hands trembled as she set down the sack of flour. She wanted to scream that they knew nothing of her life, of the pain she carried, of the nights she had prayed for deliverance. But she kept her head bowed, swallowing the lump in her throat. James, standing near the counter, noticed the exchange. His jaw tightened, though he said nothing in the store. Later, as they rode home in the wagon, his voice broke the silence. "Don't listen to them," he muttered. Clara glanced at him, startled. It's hard not to, when every word feels like a blade. His eyes, shadowed by the brim of his hat, flickered with something almost like regret. "They'll talk until they find a new target. Let them." What matters is you've got a roof over your head now." The words were meant as comfort, but they stung. Clara bit her lip and turned her gaze to the horizon. A roof, yes. Safety, yes. But what of dignity? What of belonging? Days bled into weeks. Clara learned the rhythm of ranch life, the endless chores, the creak of saddles, the dust that clung to every breath. James worked tirelessly, driving cattle, repairing fences, hauling water from the well. He gave her no cruelty, yet no tenderness either. They lived side by side like strangers forced into proximity, their conversations brief, their evenings heavy with silence. Still, Clara began to notice the cracks in his armor. At night, when he thought she slept, James would sit by the fire, a worn locket in his hands. His thumb traced the metal until his shoulders trembled with a grief he never voiced. Clara knew better than to ask, yet her heart ached to understand. She sensed that his past, like hers, was a wound that refused to heal. It was late one evening when shadows of the past finally came clawing back. A letter arrived at the cabin, its envelope smudged with dust and ink. James read it by lantern light, his brow furrowing as his eyes moved across the page. Clara, sewing quietly nearby, glanced up at his sudden stillness. "What is it?" she asked softly. He folded the letter with deliberate care, slipping it into his pocket. "Nothing that concerns you." But the lie was transparent. Clara had seen the flicker of pain in his expression, the tightening of his jaw. She wanted to press him, to demand he share what haunted him, but she feared pushing against the wall he guarded so fiercely. So she remained silent, though the question gnawed at her long into the night. Her own shadows were no less heavy. Clara had fled a life she never spoke of, carrying secrets she had locked deep inside her heart. Each time she felt James's eyes on her, a quiet dread stirred within her. What if he discovered the truth? Would he cast her out, stripping her of the fragile safety she had found? Or worse, would he see her as the town already did, as a woman unworthy of trust? One stormy night, as thunder rolled across the plains, the weight of silence finally broke. Clara stood by the window, watching rain streak across the glass, when James's voice came low and strained. "My wife," he began, the words halting. "She died 3 years ago. Childbirth. Took the baby with her." His hands clenched at his sides, knuckles white. "Since then, I've had nothing but the land and the work. And it's been enough. Until now." Clara turned, her heart twisting. She saw not the stoic rancher the town respected, but a man carved hollow by loss. For a moment, she longed to cross the room, to lay her hand upon his and tell him he wasn't alone. But fear held her back, the fear of her own secrets, the fear that if she opened her past, it would only widen the gulf between them. "I'm sorry," she whispered instead. "Truly I am." Their eyes met in the dim glow of the fire, and something unspoken passed between them, pain recognizing pain, sorrow reaching towards sorrow. But just as quickly, James turned away, retreating once more behind his silence. The storm raged through the night, rattling windows and shaking the earth, as husband and wife sat only feet apart, yet bound by walls neither knew how to dismantle. And in the shadows of that storm, both wondered the same thing. Could a marriage built on necessity survive the truths neither dared to confess? The ranch lay quiet under a pale spring sun, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Clara hung linens on the line, her eyes drifting to the horizon where the land stretched endless and unbroken. Each day on the Callahan ranch was filled with labor, yet it was not the work that weighed on her. It was the silence, James's silence, that lingered between them like a shadow refusing to lift. But that silence was about to be shattered. It began with the arrival of a stranger. One dusty afternoon, as James repaired a section of broken fence, a rider appeared at the edge of the property. The horse was lean, the man upon it even leaner, clothed in travel-stained garments, his face weathered by wind and sorrow. James stood, suspicion sharpening his gaze. Few men came uninvited to his land, and fewer still with honest intentions. The rider dismounted slowly, removing his hat. "Callahan?" he asked, his voice hoarse. James nodded, his hand never far from the revolver at his hip. "Who's asking?" The stranger hesitated, then reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. "Name's Reverend Parker. I was sent from Galveston. I bring word of your boy." The world seemed to still around James. The hammer he held slipped from his grasp, landing in the dirt with a dull thud. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with disbelief. "My boy is dead." The Reverend shook his head slowly, sorrow in his eyes. "No, sir. He lives." Clara, who had come running from the house at the sound of voices, froze at the foot of the corral. Her breath caught as she looked from James's stricken face to the weary Reverend. She had never heard James speak of a son saved for the single confession on that storm-racked night. Even then, he had spoken as if the child had been buried with his wife. Yet here was a man claiming otherwise. James's eyes narrowed, fury warring with desperate hope. "Don't play games with me, preacher. My wife, she died giving birth. They told me the boy was lost too." "I don't pretend to know the whole story," Reverend Parker replied, holding out the parchment. "But I've seen the child. He bears your name, your blood." With trembling hands, James snatched the letter. He unfolded it, scanning the words, his lips moving silently. Clara stepped closer, trying to read the storm gathering in his face. His jaw clenched, his breath uneven. When he lowered the page, his eyes were wild. "Where is he?" The Reverend placed a hand on James's shoulder. "At the orphanage in Galveston. He was left there as an infant, abandoned, but not forgotten. He's about 6 now." Clara felt her knees weaken. 6 years old. A boy who should have been James's pride, his legacy, hidden away in an orphanage while James drowned himself in solitude. Her heart ached for him, for both of them. Without another word, James strode toward the barn, his movement sharp with purpose. "I'm leaving tonight." Clara hurried after him. "James, wait." He stopped abruptly, turning on her with eyes ablaze. "Don't you understand? My son is alive." His voice broke, raw and unguarded. "I thought I buried him with her. I thought I had nothing left but this land." And all this time, he choked on the words, pressing the heel of his hand against his forehead. Clara reached for him, but he pulled away, consumed by a grief too long held captive. For the first time since she had known him, the fortress of his silence had crumbled, and she saw the man beneath, wounded, desperate, yet filled with a fierce and trembling hope. That night, James prepared his horse with restless energy, saddlebags packed in haste. Clara lingered by the door, torn between speaking and staying silent. Finally, she stepped forward. "Let me come with you." James turned, startled. "This is my burden, Clara, not yours." "It's not just your burden anymore," she said gently. "We are bound now by law, by vow. If you face this past alone, it will consume you. Let me help." For a moment, he searched her face, as though weighing whether to trust her with this most fragile hope. At last, he gave a reluctant nod. "All right. But understand, if this turns out to be false, if he's not truly mine," his voice faltered, "I don't know if I can survive that loss again." The journey south stretched over days, the trail unforgiving. Yet in the quiet rhythm of travel, something shifted between them. James, though still guarded, began to speak more, fragments of memory slipping through the cracks. He told Clara of his wife's laughter, of the cradle he had built with his own hands, of the night everything had shattered. Clara listened, her heart breaking not only for his past but for the loneliness that had defined his present. At night, by the fire, Clara longed to share her own secrets, to confess the shadows that haunted her. But fear held her tongue. What if her truth only drove him further away? So she listened instead, offering what comfort she could with her presence. At last, they reached Galveston. The orphanage loomed like a relic of sorrow, its stone walls streaked with years of rain. James dismounted, his hands trembling as he pushed through the gate. Inside, Children's laughter echoed faintly down the halls. The matron, a kindly woman with weary eyes, led them to a small yard. "He's out back, playing with the others." James's steps faltered as he followed her, his breath ragged. Then, in the sunlight beyond the doorway, he saw him, a boy of 6, dark-haired, with eyes so achingly familiar they seemed to pierce his soul. The child glanced up, a wooden toy clutched in his small hands. For a heartbeat, time stopped. James gripped the doorframe, his knees threatening to give way. "Sweet Lord," he whispered. "It's him." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, tears burning her eyes. The boy tilted his head, studying James with innocent curiosity, unaware of the storm his existence had unleashed. Does he know?" James asked hoarsely. The matron shook her head softly. "No. He only knows he was left here as a baby." James stepped forward, unable to stop himself. Each stride was heavy, weighted with 6 years of loss. The boy blinked up at him, uncertain but unafraid. And in that moment, as father and son stood face to face, the world shifted. The boy's laughter carried across the orphanage yard like a fragile melody, one James feared might vanish if he breathed too loudly. 6 years of emptiness, 6 years of silence, and here stood the son he had thought buried with his wife. Clara stood a step behind him, her heart aching at the sight. James's shoulders trembled under the weight of emotion he fought to contain. She had seen him face storms and loss with a hard jaw and wordless strength, but this trembling vulnerability was something entirely different. The boy looked up from his wooden toy, curiosity bright in his dark eyes. "Mister, do I know you?" James swallowed hard, his voice strangled. "Not yet, son. Not yet." The matron, watching with quiet understanding, beckoned the boy over. "Eli," she said gently, "this man has come a long way to see you." "Eli." The name hit James like a prayer. He had whispered that name once, years ago, cradling his infant in a grief-soaked dream before being told the child was gone. Now here it was, alive, breathing, staring up at him with the same steady gaze that had once belonged to his wife. Clara's hand brushed James's arm, grounding him. She saw the war in his eyes, the desperate need to claim the boy as his own, clashing with the terror of rejection. "Do you want to sit with me a while?" James asked softly, crouching so he was eye level with the child. Eli tilted his head, studying the stranger's lined face. Then he nodded, slipping his small hand into James's rough, calloused one. In that touch, James felt his world shift. That night, they stayed in town. The orphanage had allowed James to spend the day with Eli, but the question of tomorrow hung heavy in the air. Clara found James sitting alone outside the inn, the moonlight carving deep lines into his weary face. He held the boy's wooden toy in his hands, turning it over and over like a sacred relic. "He doesn't know who I am," James murmured. "And what if telling him? What if it only confuses him? What right do I have to turn his world upside down after all this time?" Clara lowered herself beside him. The right of a father who never stopped grieving. The right of a man who thought his son was gone, but still kept his memory alive. "That's not confusion, James, that's truth." He looked at her, his eyes glistening. "But truth doesn't erase the years he's lost without me. It doesn't erase the nights I should have been there, the mornings I should have held him. Duty, love, where was either of those when he needed me most?" Her voice softened, trembling with its own unspoken pain. "Sometimes love is buried under duty. Sometimes both are stolen from us before we can give them. You can't change the past, but you can choose what you'll be to him now." James turned away, his breath shuddering. "And what if he doesn't want me?" Clara reached for his hand, steady and sure. "Then you'll keep showing him you're here. Because love isn't proven in a day. It's lived, James. And that boy deserves a father who will fight to give it, no matter how late it comes." For the first time, he let her hold his hand without pulling away. The next morning, James returned to the orphanage, resolve burning beneath his uncertainty. Clara stayed close, sensing he needed her presence as much as Eli needed his. The matron gathered them in her office. "If you wish to claim him, Mr. Callahan, the law requires proof. Testimony, documents that will take time." "I'll do whatever's needed," James replied, firm but quiet. His eyes flicked toward the yard where Eli played. "But I won't let him wait in doubt." He stepped outside, calling softly, "Eli." The boy looked up, a hesitant smile spreading across his face. James crouched again, his heart pounding. "I need to tell you something important. About who I am and who you are to me." The child's eyes widened with cautious wonder. "I'm your father, Eli," James said, voice raw with truth. "I thought I lost you, but I was wrong. I've been waiting for this moment for years, even when I didn't know it would come." For a long moment, silence stretched. Then Eli blinked, his small brow furrowing. "Father? Like mine?" James nodded, tears stinging his eyes. "Yes, son. Yours." Eli studied him, then glanced at Clara as if searching for confirmation. She offered the gentlest smile, nodding once. Slowly, Eli stepped forward. His tiny arms wrapped around James's neck, tentative at first, then fierce. James broke, holding him close, his chest heaving with sobs he could no longer contain. For the first time in years, the silence inside him was shattered, not by pain, but by love. Days turned into weeks as James and Clara remained in Galveston. Papers were signed, testimonies given, and at last the law recognized what blood already had. Eli Callahan was no longer an orphan. He was a son restored. Yet restoration carried its own weight. James often watched the boy sleep, guilt gnawing at him for the lost years. He feared he would never be enough to make up for them. One evening, Clara found him sitting by the hearth, Eli curled asleep in his lap. James's eyes were far away, lost in shadows. "You're thinking you've failed him," she said softly. He looked up startled. "Haven't I? A father's first duty is to be there. I wasn't." Clara knelt beside him, her voice steady with conviction. "Duty is the bond of law. Love is the bond of the heart. You've carried your duty to the land, to the memory of your wife. But this love? This is what will heal him. And you." Her words struck him deeper than he expected. He studied her, realizing that Clara too had borne her own buried grief, yet she chose every day to stand, to give, to love. Slowly, he reached for her hand. "Clara, you've given me more than I deserve. Not just him. You've given me hope again." She met his gaze, her own eyes shimmering. "And you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, a family." Weeks later, they returned to the Callahan Ranch. The land no longer felt desolate. It rang with Eli's laughter, with Clara's quiet songs as she worked, with the steady rhythm of life renewed. One evening, as the sun sank in a blaze of gold, James stood watching Clara and Eli in the yard. The boy was chasing fireflies, Clara's laughter mingling with his. For the first time, James did not feel like a man haunted by the past. He felt like a man alive in the present, bound not by duty alone, but by something far greater. Love beyond duty. Love that healed, restored, and gave him back a life he thought forever lost. And as Clara's eyes met his across the twilight, James knew this was only the beginning.